Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's actually it's both an honor. It's also daunting because it's Tamayo, and um, I also come at this ultimately from the major muralist kind of perspective. So, but Tamayo, when you asked me, I thought I can't say no to talk about Tamayo because I guess just full disclosure, he's my favorite of all Mexican artists, and he's my favorite for a variety of reasons, and they're the reasons that I ultimately am going to tell you here today in this sort of talk. But I thought I would. I'm going to share screen. I've made a little childlike PowerPoint for you guys. Can you all see that relatively well?
Yes.
I'm going to come back to this image, the dialogue, but I think it's essential to like understanding his relationship ultimately with revolution and revolutionary art. But I thought I'd start also, Elizabeth, with a personal anecdote. When I was in Mexico City in 91, and which is telling because Tamayo dies in 91. But I was there and I had gone to Zapotec Park, just like taking some time off from archives, and decided to be a tourist for a minute, and hadn't really put two and two together, didn't realize that the Tamayo Museum was there. And so I'm just sitting there by myself, watching with great fascination bullfighting practice, which it happened to be that the apartment building that I was living in was right next door to this kind of bullfighting academy. And I would peek through these sort of, little iron, grates, and I would look through and I would see them doing this with a bicycle. So it's like a front bicycle wheel and a bullfighting horns. And I'm watching them. I'm kind of fascinated with them because it's oddly beautiful, as static as that looks. I didn't realize that I was really 2 feet from the museum. And when they took a break, I was talking to them about it, and they said, "You're here to see the museum?" And I was like, "Yeah, the Anthropology Museum." They said, "No, the Tamayo Museum." And they said, "The Tamayo Museum, that's the real Mexican museum." And I was like, "Oh," it's like, "Yeah, I mean," and so they were actually kind of rejecting on some level the idea that, I don't know, American tourists would come and look at artifacts from pre-Hispanic kind of period as being the essential and authentic, sort of Mexico. And they really thought Tamayo was the idea of Mexico, which of course made me go in there. So I went, and it is an amazing museum. There's only a couple of you, so I can ask questions like, have you all been to Mexico City? Have you been to the Tamayo Museum? A couple? It is, so he donates all of his personal art. He does this twice, and I'll talk about his pre-Hispanic art collection in a minute, but this is all of his modern art, all of his really valuable paintings that many he was sort of gifted in exchanges through friends of the sort of litany of famous people. And he really wants to donate it. And he starts, and somewhere in the mid-70s, he starts offering this, but there's resistance to Tamayo, in part because he wants to have control over the architecture of the building. And he wants to do it in a kind of a modern way. And he gets promises of funding from private sources. So the idea is that this is going to be a privately funded museum. And he also insists that his personal name is on it. It's the Rufino Tamayo Museum. And so there's some resistance until 1980. I'm gonna have to look it up. 1983. And he says, and he introduces the museum when it's finally opened. There's resistance for years. He finally gets it open, and he comes out to talk in front of this museum, out in the sort of lawn that you can see on that sort of to the left in the image. And he, sorry, it's in 1981, and he comes out in 81, and everyone expects him to talk about the contents of this museum, but instead he starts off and he goes, "So, I hope this puts something along the lines. I'm going to summarize most of it. I hope this puts an end to all the envy all these Mexican artists have shown me over the years and their rejection of me because I'm the one who made a lot of money, basically." So he comes out to this in this moment where finally in 81, he's getting his his moment, and says that, and then he says, quote, "You know the famous phrase of Siqueiros, ours is the only path." Can you believe that? To say that ours is the only path when the fundamental thing in art is freedom? In art, there are millions of paths, as many paths as there are artists. And then he talks a little bit about how, you got to go in and see all this amazing art. But so in 1981, introducing his own museum when the three great ones, the big three, are all dead, he takes it as a moment to sort of a moment to kind of say, I have vindication and I have a claim that art has to be, that free art must also be multiple art. And aside from what was perceived both in Mexico and abroad as a kind of pettiness on his part, seeing as they weren't there to answer, it does show that the break that he has with those big muralist artists, Orozco, Rivera, and Siqueiros, is hugely important to him. It really matters to him. And so much so that when he has this sort of one of the grander moments he has in Mexico, he takes the opportunity to kind of point that out. One other thing I'll say, I'll be quick about this because I know we don't actually have that much time, but I came to an interest in Mexican art largely from the perspective of New Deal art borrowing of muralism. So and when I kind of came across the sort of George Biddle, he's a fantastic artist who traveled all around the world and did a lot of really sort of figurative drawing, but really interesting. Biddle had gone to school, I think Choate or something with FDR, and he writes him a letter because he's down there during the revolution. He writes him a letter that basically says, listen, the way that you could sell the New Deal is the way they are doing it in Mexico, is they're paying artists plumbers' wages to decorate their buildings with their socialist message. You could do the same in the United States. And that kind of obviously leads to first the commissioning actual Mexican artists to do that. And then the whole sort of failure of that, and finally using American artists. And I won't go into that story because I'm sure you all know it. And also it's not about Tamayo. But so I came to that interest in this art as this sort of public art, and in the idea that the public art would be popular, verge on propaganda, maybe jump right into propaganda, but be sort of an elemental part of what essentially became kind of national identity construction. And then shortly thereafter, ultimately a kind of foreign policy strategy, because when President Carranza finally consolidates power in 1917, one of the very first things he does, like within days, is he sends envoys down to Central America to champion the Mexican Revolution and encourage the Central American nations to emulate it, and including giving art scholarships, which is interesting. Although Carranza's really he's not our revolutionary champion. It's Obregón, and then later Cárdenas are the big names. But I was looking at U.S.-Mexican relations, and there's kind of a rabbit hole of oh wow, this is all about cultural strategies. And then I kind of realized in my own work that the United States was borrowing hand over fist those cultural strategies. When the United States found out that there had been those envoys, we sent our own envoys. And when they offered scholarships, we offered more art scholarships. When they offered to build a radio station, we offered to build radio stations that had greater bandwidth, basically, so that we could sort of, they could receive, music and information from Mexico City, but they could also get it from Miami now. So I sort of, that's where I came to this sort of whole general topic of sort of art, culture, and the Mexican Revolution from. So, what I'd like to, I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. I'm sure you know a little bit about him, but what's important is that, so he's orphaned at about the age of 11. He's born in 1899, and both of his parents are basically by the time the Mexican Revolution starts. So he is, in 1910, he is orphaned, and he's taken in by his aunt, who is a fruit vendor. One of the things that she sells are watermelons. And I figured at some point it's going to come up, might as well just jump into it. And if you look at these dates, he and there are earlier ones. I just, 28 is the earliest, but he basically for his entire life likes the still life as a subject, and particularly interested in fruit and fruit vendors. There's lots and lots of fruit vendors. I held back and didn't throw too much at you. I just thought it would be entertaining on some level to see how much he sort of goes there. And it's important in part because critics of him over the years have often said, if we see him as somehow Mexican, like a kind of a Mexican artist, which essentially the more revolutionary artists considered him to be less Mexican than he ought to be, that he wasn't being true to the Mexican national identity construction project of the revolution, and he's drawing watermelons. His view, however, was that if you want to understand Mexico, this is what it is. It is fruit, it is people selling things, it is his experience, his actual visceral experience of the sensual and tactile world of the melon. Almost every critic throws in the idea that he almost always, with very, very few exceptions, paints cut watermelons, which by his own account, and certainly Octavio Paz's assessment, is really a kind of a nod to the Mesoamerican. This is a sacrifice with a clear and bloody kind of reference that these are the visceral images of a Mesoamerican identity, which he, of course, as being a sort of coming from Oaxaca and being half Zapotec, he identified very strongly with the indigenous sort of roots. He actually really tries to get him to get into the idea of a small business and enrolls him in accounting classes, but he just keeps sneaking off and taking art classes. And finally, she says something along the lines of, okay, to hell with it, let's just enroll you in the sort of fine arts. So he starts taking, from about 1917 to 1920, he is enrolled, but he increasingly, essentially, biographers will sort of put it in two ways. One is he pursues independent sort of education, art education. The other way, which I think is probably more relevant, is that he was doing it actually in a collective space in open air schools that are free. And they first were established actually in 1913, but they really hit their stride a little bit later. And he's going and he's self-teaching, but he's doing it in the context of someone who can help instruct. And there's a whole sort of a kind of ultimately and increasingly radical instructional philosophy that goes with these open air. So he prefers those to the more classical sort of education, which is relevant because it is exactly how he develops in this context of realizing, there's more than one way to teach art. There's more than one way to think of art. His first gig for 5 years, his first real job is that he is the head of drafting at the Archaeological Museum in Mexico City. The job boils down to he actually draws images of sculptures and other Mesoamerican artifacts. He draws them for a couple of reasons. One to kind of catalog things, but also he does it in order to make replicas. This is also in a kind of biographical note of my own, kind of interesting because when I was in Mexico, my mother and sister came to visit, and I rented a car and we're driving all around. We're driving in the middle of, I can't even remember where it was now, but driving along, and my mother's constantly asking me to translate every sign. So we're driving along. She's like, "Well, what is that sign?" And I said, "That one says authentic ancient artifacts made here." And she was like, "I want to see that." So we stop. It's like she's like, "Authentic ancient artifacts made." I was like, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it says." So we go in there, and it is a workshop that had started, according to the guy we talked to there, in the 1920s during the revolution, as part of a way to kind of reconstruct some of to make accessible some of the sort of Mesoamerican artifacts to other places. So you'd have the stuff that you see in Mexico City, it gets replicated at this high standard and then put in smaller museums around so that even if you can't get to Mexico City, you can see it. It was a part of that program. My mother was delighted by this, and she bought a whole bunch of stuff, which was ridiculous. And I'm going to jump ahead just because I'm through this one. When she passed, I decided that I would go ahead and take one of these authentic ancient artifacts that had been made in the little workshop. So I'm going to go back a little bit to an earlier screen. His sketches inform a lot of his art. So that experience, that sort of that self-training that he gets, he uses whatever training he gets in this education, but then, and by his own testimony, learning to draw three-dimensional things. So he's drawing mainly sculptures. That's what he was mostly interested in. And what he wanted to do was to capture a kind of sculpture-like physicality to his art, which I'll talk more about later, but he really thought if you want to understand Mesoamerican art, it is not just making likenesses of those things. It is somehow capturing the substance of the thing. And so you see like some obvious, right? I mean, just look at the faces and you can either buy or not buy that these things I've assembled for you have similarities. He collects a lot of art. In '74, in Oaxaca, he donates all of his pre-Hispanic artifacts, and there's a small museum which is absolutely lovely. If you're ever in Oaxaca, it is absolutely, I mean, you probably will only spend half an hour in there. It's not that huge, but it's beautifully laid out, and it is like when you see it, you're like, oh yeah, I kind of get why Tamayo had that sort of sculpturalness to his art. So I'm gonna jump to another one. This is, and you know, Laurie, you mentioned Octavio Paz's essays. You know, Octavio Paz, as I'll talk a little bit more about, because he and Rufino they become really good friends by 43, but by 38, they are sort of kindred spirits in terms of art. But he says he talks about Mesoamerican art beautifully. Octavio Paz does, and I like this quote. The dual lesson of pre-Hispanic art, first of all, fidelity to the material of the form. Sorry, for the Aztec, the stone sculpture is sculptured stone. And then after that, the sculptured stone is a metaphor, geometry and transfiguration, which is to say, I think Paz is trying to say, it's first and foremost stone. And when you look at a lot of the art, even the art that is criticized as somehow middle-class and anti-revolutionary, it has that substance, which if we buy Paz's claim, fits in with the sort of desire of revolutionary artists to somehow capture and use the idea that Mesoamerican art is the starting point for Mexican art. This one, I'm going to throw one more out here in part out of sport, but one of the images that by Tamayo's own testimony he really likes is Zapotec, who is both a death and fertility god. Not the major death nor the major fertility god, but both death and fertility, and is almost always shown in a kind of shouting sort of space. But it is, and I'm going to talk a little bit more, but he has a lot of sort of shouting images, which often are very specific and protesting. They're kind of protest images, as even the 47 one was, which I'll get to a little bit later. But I think he likes it because the protest and the rebirth, the death and the fertility are so elemental in the Mesoamerican identity that he often connects these, and you could see them, and that would be a whole lecture, which someone better suited to it than I could give to you. But all of these images, including the one that, you know, like the Elizabeth, you used the Sun and Moon, one of the kind of classic lithograph. It's actually a mixograph, right? It's one of the classic mixographs, and he himself sort of would say that the cool thing about sort of the Mexican relationship with the moon and the sun as balancing is that in the Aztec/Mayan worldview, that they were both sources of light. I mean, obviously, we know that one's a reflected source of light, but they didn't necessarily know that we have these two sources of light, one from the dark and one from the bright, and that they are equally important. So he's constantly repeating the themes. During the same period, so while he's doing this, you have an important figure that is often neglected, and he's neglected for some reasons. Ultimately, he's neglected sometimes for reasons of, I don't know, ignorance, but I think other times a kind of what today we would call canceling. I think Vasconcelos has been kind of canceled, and to some extent, probably for some good reasons. Octavio Paz, again, actually calls him a genius. He's like, he's our genius. And I gave you a quote here just to kind of get at the sort of indigenous sort of aspect. He becomes the first real sort of revolutionary minister of public education, and he is the one who starts the Mural school. So he's the one who actually gives all the big three their commissions for those public art. It is under his sort of auspices, originally starting in 22. It ends in 28, but there's that sort of period that he starts, and ultimately Obregón sort of presides over it, and it continues for a while. He says this, which I think is interesting. It's sort of our national project is not aiming at shutting itself up within our geographic borders, but because its intent is to create the essential traits of an indigenous Hispano-American culture. I won't go too far into this, but he's a fan of Rodó. Are y'all familiar with this author? So an Uruguayan author who writes Ariel at the turn of the century in 1899 or something like this. And it is a instant Latin American classic in 1899, in 1900. It is actually, as I read somewhere, that it is a book that was in every single Latin American country for decades was required reading. In it, he makes the argument essentially that that all of Latin America is like Ariel from The Tempest, and North America is Caliban. And that the true essence of a spirituality, as opposed to a kind of commercial, gross, consuming, vulgar, sort of glorifying North American culture is superior, and it is superior in part because there is a natural, for Rodó, it is a Creole connection between the best of what was indigenous and the best of what was Spanish, and this blending creates this sort of special spiritual Hispanic culture, far more spiritual than it is in Spain, and far more, he uses the language of ultimately civilized and sophisticated than it is in the Americas, but that the two together are this great thing. Vasconcelos is a fan of this, a huge fan of it, and wants to actually sort of, in a sense, make it so. So he is the Minister of Public Education and starts all kinds of programs. It is music, it is dance, it is visual art, it is theater. He really profoundly believes that spirituality, the essence of sort of Mexicanness, is its spirituality, and it can be best promoted through the arts. He also is the one who takes the open air schools and he formalizes them and spreads them. And he formalizes them with an emphasis on the idea that even in rural communities, there needs to be instruction that is devoted also to the arts. So he was like today, obviously he's, because of his ultimately kind of racist views, weirdly, he would not be sort of that popular, obviously, but at the time he was kind of like a core curriculum guy, where he basically thought you need to have art and culture and music and culture to have it in a core curriculum. You can't be Mexico. You can't achieve any further greatness unless we really have well-rounded citizens. And it doesn't matter whether they're working the land or whether they're working in a factory. Everyone equally needs to be able to develop these skills, because individual expression is vital. he's criticized for a lot of reasons, and I won't belabor this, but one of the criticisms that I think is pretty damning is sort of the idea that he basically thought that what today we would call self-taught art, we used to call folk art, we'd call it self-taught art, that self-taught art with very little instruction, a kind of authentic expression, and he used the language of childlike, is best suited to teaching the sort of indigenous population. So he's certainly criticized for a kind of dismissiveness of their, you know, I don't know, of their ability to kind of ultimately become artists. A lot of the open air, even within the sort of the instructors in these open air schools, they often would say things like, you know, you really shouldn't, first of all, you shouldn't even teach anyone any art until about the age of 10 or 11, because the imagination, if you develop the imagination, an expressive imagination prior to that, then you can never rein it back in, which is curious. So the open air schools have some conservative elements to it, but the idea is that they're free, anyone can take it, and that everyone is encouraged to become literate in not just words, but images, music, etc., which is, say, core curriculum kind of stuff. Not only did Tamayo attend some of these, but he also then becomes an instructor. So during this period, while he is the director of drafting at the Anthropology Museum, he's also instructing in open air schools. Open air schools are complex for a lot of reasons, and I'm going to come back to them in a second, but I want to say one more word about sort of this idea of Mexicanness. For Vasconcelos, he really emphasizes both Mexicanness, Mexicanidad, indigeneity, which is like indigenismo, like a kind of indigenism, like everyone needs to embrace an sort of an indigenous identity. He also is a champion simultaneously of mestizaje, which is to say a mestizo identity, and encourages the government to sort of essentially kind of legally legislate against anything but a mestizo identity, that every Mexican is legally mestizo. You can't, and his point was, we can't have laws that apply to indigenous population that is different from people who are Creole or mestizo. So he's sort of championing this idea of a mixed identity, but he also is trying to essentially, I don't know, force Mexico to become colorblind, which is another reason for which he's criticized later, that you can't just say we're all mestizo and make that some kind of a kind of cultural affectation if it's not internalized. Does that make sense? So he is this figure who of the people that he works with the big three, and he works with Tamayo, and he kind of favors Tamayo. He thinks that Tamayo is this sort of young buck. And one thing that's kind of important, I'm not going to remember the dates, but Siqueiros is only a couple of years older than Tamayo. But Rivera and Orozco are both quite a bit older. So that when Tamayo comes to the sort of the scene, you know, he's basically 20, 23 years old. And I don't know, Orozco is something like 17 years older, and I don't know, Rivera's maybe 15 years older, somewhere more like. So they see him as a kind of a young pup. Vasconcelos is kind of like, yeah, you remind me of me when I was a young man, kind of. So he gets a little bit favored, and it does sort of piss specifically Siqueiros off. Siqueiros is like, well, I'm young, and why do you think he's so great? Because Siqueiros hasn't quite radicalized yet, not to the degree that he becomes radicalized. So he's chosen, and this idea of trying to promote through image the idea of a Mexican identity, which is both indigenous and mestizo, and somehow new, and also really ancient, is all kind of part and parcel of it. The break that ultimately Tamayo has with the kind of more revolutionary artists does, on one level, come down to the question of who is better at Mexicanness. And they kind of compete a little bit on that issue. And they both basically say, you don't understand what Mexicanness is. So I'm just going to offer to start these images. And quite a bit later than these images, sort of in the kind of 50s. He has this quote, which I kind of like, just because as I'm looking for various images just of like, you know, rural Mexican individuals, all of their backs are turned. He says, of course, I don't believe in photographic likeness. I eliminate details. For example, eyes, if I don't need them. I aim for the essential until I say what I want to say with fewer and fewer elements. So that's a bit out of context in terms of the sort of the Mexicanness goal, but it is, I think, with that view, you kind of get a sense of how all of these the kind of the sellers, the washers, the boatmen, the farmers, are all just their bodies in that kind of almost Mesoamerican statuesque kind of way. If you turn them around, you could almost imagine that they would look like some of those artifacts in his pre-Hispanic museum. And in fact, I don't know about y'all, but when I look at them, I want to grab them and turn them around. It's almost compelling. Like you see just the back, and suddenly they become three-dimensional in that way, and it is kind of powerful, I think. Okay, I'm gonna say a little bit more about the open air schools. One thing that is, so Luz Jimenez, I don't know if anyone's encountered, there's a book about her, which is fantastic, written by her grandson, I believe. She, in these open air schools for the artists, she would go around, and she was primarily a teacher, but she was also a model, and she modeled as the indigenous woman as instruction. She's like, no, you guys don't get it. Look at me. So she would sort of perform it, and then everyone was like, I got to use her. So you have Rivera, Orozco, and this is probably one of the most famous Orozco paintings. This is Cortés y la Malinche. Right? Are you all familiar with this image? Right. That's Luz Jimenez in a detail from one of the music murals that Tamayo makes in 1933, which is his first mural. He uses her, but interestingly, because he eliminates anything he doesn't need, you don't get her eyes. So this, and later he is a little critical of making too much of a fetish out of the indigenous woman. And she's really trying, Luz is really trying to get essentially these well-off, very connected painters to understand, no, it's simpler than this, right? Got to bring it down, you got to bring it down. So she's a huge figure in these open air schools, and Tamayo, actually all of them are buddies with her. She's one of the instructors, and she's kind of held up as kind of the classic sort of revolutionary woman in the arts, like the soldadera of the arts. I'm going to move on because I want to make sure we have time to chat about things. A couple of the classic images that if you look at sort of discourse on this idea of Mexicanidad, Mexicanness, and Tamayo comes up, it's usually these two images. This one, the Tehuantepec, in 39 is also when like Frida Kahlo is like the indigenous costuming that she often wears and herself paints is from Tehuantepec. It is seen as sort of iconic. And so there are a couple of critics who wonder whether there was a tongue-in-cheek part when Tamayo does it, because he was a bit critical of the idea of like, oh yeah, why don't you dress up as an indigenous woman so that to prove that you're Mexican somehow. He thought there was a kind of a fetish going on a little bit, as much as he and Kahlo actually a lot alike in certain ways. This one, I don't really know the context of the production of it, but it gets a lot of attention because it is a rare sort of moment. And it has a lot of the various elements. The basket in the front has a little bit of that kind of more representational kind of quality. And yet the almost watermelon-like colors are taking you somewhere else. And then the figure kind of sort of, I don't know, it bleeds into the background. It smears into the background. And so I don't have a grand pronouncement about it, but when I'm done with my little chat, it might be something worth talking about a little bit, exactly what we can see in these. This is a kind of a blatant, this is like the homage to the Indian race. I'm just putting this up. I so I have a little section. One of the things about the debate, and I sort of took as my charge to talk a little bit about the break between Tamayo and the big three. This is the part of the mural that he does in the School of Music in 1933, his first big mural. And I couldn't find a really great quote for it, but he often expresses the idea that at least later, and when I say later, I mean like 80s, like later in his life. He's like, the problem with muralism is big is not the only way to be monumental. You can be monumental essentially, and he's thinking back, I think, to kind of pre-Hispanic, these little figures that are just, that the weight is so physical and it is so dense and so structural that you can get the monumental even in a small thing. He says that in part because, as I'll talk about in a bit, he's a bit defensive about being seen as something like a middle-class easel painter. And so he wants to suggest that you can be monumental even on a small canvas kind of thing. So this is one of his first ones. I'm just going to show you a couple just to give you a sense of when he does do murals, what his are like. This is 43, Nature and the Artist. I gave you a little quote here. It's probably not worth wasting or using time to look at it exactly, but he paints this in 43 in Northampton Smith College. And I kind of like, just to give you the scale of it, like this sort of sense down here. It is enormous, and the thing that draws the attention is the idea of this figure and this figure, and then this one in the background, which is, so you have this idea that this is the art. This is possibly a model. This is possibly the artist. This is possibly the spectator that he's including in this artistic moment, all the elements of it, which is the way that he would start teaching back in those open air schools. He'd say, listen, if you're going to teach, you need to understand what the spectator, you need to be the spectator, you need to be the model, you need to get in the mind of all of this stuff. You just can't represent from your intellectual space. Does that make sense? All right. Quickly through these so I can get to the big conflict. This one is The Birth of Nationality. It is absolutely a surrealist piece that this is in 52, and I would say it is critical of the project of trying to create nationality. So he's got an anxiety essentially about any project of national identity construction, and he often sort of shows the damage to it. Moving right along. So this one I'm putting up, I could not find a great image of it that isn't protected from being copied, which is why it says that Tamayo still owns this image. But it's at the Foreign Relations Secretary, the Ministry of Foreign Relations, and I had a chance to see it back in the day. And I was surprised back then, and when I was thinking about this project, I had forgotten about it. But when I looked at it, I was like, oh yeah, that one. It is interesting, the images that he would put up in spaces, for instance, a space where foreign diplomats would come in, right? And look at this idea of, this is Mexico and his, I guess, his world, the Mexican and his/her world. And it is a kind of in-your-face representation of a variety of images, which I can imagine that they insist on, that if I was a foreign diplomat and I walked in for a meeting, I'd be like, yeah, I want to know why you have that up here. What is Tamayo up to? So Tamayo's inserting himself in very specifically political discourse at different places. And we can also, if we have time, we can talk about possible interpretations of it, but I do want to race through everything so that we have everything out, or maybe we can talk about it. If I am going too fast, you can tell me to slow down and I will edit more. Or is this fine to race through? You good? Angela's smiling, so I'm guessing yes. The last one was 1967. This one he paints in 1968, and it's called Fraternity. And it coincides with the student uprisings in 1968. There's a massacre in Tlatelolco. This is actually a Zocalo but and the student uprisings, which are ultimately they begin actually with a sort of high school in high school, and then university students pick it up. But it is ultimately about teaching styles and the kind of anxiety that children, these are the children now entering into university whose parents fought in the revolution, and they're sort of rebelling against some of the now much more conservative sort of elements. So they're actually responding. And he donates this. Oh, sorry, I'll have to find it again. He donates this to the United Nations building. This is in New York. So it's in New York in 1971. And that's yet another interesting sort of idea, that you'd go to the United Nations and have this image of essentially a kind of bonding ritual, but around what is essentially a conflagration, some kind of obviously something, not just, that's not a bonfire, that's something else. This one I'm going to put in just because of its coolness. Because if we're talking about monumental art, this in some ways is one of his most monumental. So I won't go on about mixography. I mean, I think if you have questions, Elizabeth is probably better suited to answering it. But he did a lot of lithographs, but he always got frustrated with the idea that he couldn't get the three-dimensional sort of textural quality to it. He wanted basically even sort of images hung on walls to be the kind of things that to be a spectator made you want to touch it, probably in that same way that I suggested you want to look at even his paintings and want to turn the figures around. He wanted you to like intervene somehow, that emotional response. So he does this, and he makes one, this thing is 5 tons. It's the biggest sort of lithographic stone in the world. And I just thought, and it's also a kind of amazing image in terms of this sort of, to segue into kind of his idea about that humanity and protest against a condition that is unjust, that to be human includes this sort of fear, and that a revolution should be about reducing it. And he ultimately, to jump to the end of the story, is he basically felt that the Mexican Revolution failed to end distress, the distress of humanity, not just the existential, but even the practical things like income distribution, et cetera. He thought the revolution was kind of a failure. And so he made a lot of images of sort of humans somewhat separated from political life, and finding their meaning more in the elemental natural reality than any kind of political life, because this would be a more overtly political statement. This one is, I know I'm going back in time, but just, he did do this one. This is his one sort of overtly revolution image. So he did do it. He kind of regretted some of it, but if you look at this, there is a kind of a violence. Like, these guys are already down. So there's something a little bit less celebratory about the revolution. Not to say that especially like Orozco didn't do that as well. He did a bunch of, this is for Elizabeth, I guess, he did a series that included some of these kinds of things. But once again, because he's a rural, he didn't use his eyes. This is his Zapatista who's looking off. But that's something that you wouldn't even know was a Tamayo, or I wouldn't have known it was a Tamayo unless I had come across it in a text. He also does these, so he does these sort of an homage to Zapata and an homage to Juarez. And I'm including this just to point out, he was not against the revolution. He was not an anti-revolutionary. He did become an anti-revolutionary art, but he was not anti-revolutionary. And one thing that I will sort of, quick anecdote. When I first got to Mexico City, got my grant to go do research, and it was literally the very first day I'm walking to Mexico City, I was surprised at the number of vendors who were kind of sitting there on the sidewalk and selling things like t-shirts and images and icons. It's probably mainly to tourists, but the tourists weren't necessarily foreign tourists. They'd also be Mexican tourists who had finally made it to the big city kind of thing. And the number of likenesses of Zapata and Pancho Villa was overwhelming. Overwhelming. Every corner you could get a, and I, in retrospect, I regret I didn't buy a couple. But one of the things that's amazing when you look at the Mexican Revolution is that the heroes that are held up, the hero of the rural rebellion is absolutely Zapata. Still, in the minds of Mexicans today, he is the hero. The hero of the northern rebellion is Pancho Villa, for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to get into. Zapata is assassinated by the first revolutionary president, Carranza. Pancho Villa is assassinated by the second one, Obregón, who himself is seen as the big champion of the muralist movement. And he is the big advocate of a kind of really great funding for the kind of inclusive strategies of education in all forms. He, in 1928, is, I'm gonna forget I think it's not Gil and not Rodriguez, the other guy. He's assassinated during the Maximato, which is to say the Calles period. Calles has Obregón, who is the last truly revolutionary. They are all assassinated. And yet they are still held up. And the Tamayos' view of all of this is that the revolution had very quickly, from Zapata's assassination in 1919, Pancho Villa in 1923, that by 1923, something along the lines of, we know this revolution isn't real anymore, that we are paying homage to these figures, but we don't actually pay homage to these figures by doing what they wanted. I mean, especially Zapata. Maybe Pancho Villa maybe didn't want something quite as noble as what Zapata wanted. So, and Juarez is the same. So Juarez, he is by putting this indigenous woman's face in front, the homage to Juarez is the only way that we can actually honor Juarez, is actually to honor the indigenous population truly, and not in this way that has gone off the rails essentially. So he's very critical of the revolution, and therefore kind of critical of the kind of the big three's seeming support for it. But it gets more complicated than that. I don't know how, we only have till 3:30, so I don't want to go too much further, but I want to jump into two other quick. So I'm going to skip a bunch of slides. I'm going to make my shout out to Jay. So in this quote actually comes from the 1940s. What is the date of Air? That doesn't come out to the 50s. So no, Air Mexican comes out in like 52 or something, right? Is that right, 52? So this quote obviously comes out later. And it's by Marta Traba, she's an art historian, but she also is a novelist who's fantastic. And Lori might remember that I probably made you read Mothers and Shadows. So she also wrote a sort of a text on Latin American art. But there are kind of two groups that we sort of think of. One, so that these contemporaries, who include famously Tamayo and Octavio Paz, are in 1938, when Trotsky, Andre Breton, and Diego Rivera all signed the new manifesto of revolutionary art, is really the moment when the contemporaries and Tamayo personally break. So when Tamayo breaks formally with these figures, he does it in the company of people like Octavio Paz. And I kind of like the quote just because of Jay's lecture that in this text basically says, this is a moment when she says, tended to situate surrealism. What she really means is, particularly of this group, in the realm of literature, which would be the kind of comment that would infuriate Tamayo, because he always accused the large sort of muralists as being too essentially prosaic in their presentations. It was more like literature. You were trying to say a thing. So that's my shout out to you. I'm gonna race through. I'm gonna skip these images of protest, which are awesome. And I want to talk a little bit about his galaxy stuff, which is fantastic. This heavenly bodies, you can see the figure here on the right, right? I have a nice one. This is from Paz's probably most famous essay about Tamayo. Says, modern thought maintains that man is no longer the center of the universe, nor a measure of all things. The idea is not very far removed from the vision that the ancients had of man and the cosmos. And in the section where he talks about it, he really talks about the idea that the Mesoamerican idea of what humanity was a stiff and elemental sort of reality compared to the fluidity of the gods. And so these, and he has, and as you all know, anyone who knows anything about Tamayo, there's not millions, but there's 10s, 20s, 30s of these sort of images of these kind of constellations. And I always kind of wonder what constellations he's exactly using, because I tried to run it to ground whether he's using like Mayan Aztec constellations or Greek Roman ones. I don't know. He seems to be making up his own ones. This one, I've never seen it. It's in Dallas. It's giant, El Hombre. So in 53, he does this just giant one. And this is probably one of the most famous ones, women reaching for the moon. And so what I would put to you is that in some ways, his revolutionary spirit about the human condition is twofold. One is recognizing that the government will always fail to bridge between people if they end up using what he would call didactic art. That ultimately the art has to allow us to recognize our own, the kind of the universal themes and our sort of humanity in it. That the government should be doing things like making sure that the income is distributed, not that they have any sort of formal ideas of what the kind of rules of art should be. Let me, this I think speaks for itself in a way. This one is interesting because in one way, he was super interested in Picasso, and he really liked the way that Picasso helped him get at what was the growing, terror, cosmic terror, which really is connected to ultimately the atom bomb. So in this sort of post-war order, he begins to realize that the Mexican Revolution didn't actually make us less afraid, and the world itself is becoming a more fearful space. And to be a true artist, we need to sort of sort that. I'm not going to talk about this one because I don't have time. The last image I'm going to give you, and then I have a couple of things to say if you all feel like there's time. But this one, so this is Prometheus offering fire to humans, and kind of like the fraternity image that he gives to the UN. This is an image which pretty much every critic that I've seen points out that here you have Prometheus giving fire to man, but the world is already aflame. And this and some of the other images that I've shown you, from the point of view of those kind of revolutionary artists who were kind of sticking with the claims of what the Manifesto of Revolutionary Art would say, thought that this was ultimately a kind of criticism of the Mexican Revolution. The reason that Tamayo, I think, has such staying power is because most historians, when they're looking at the Mexican Revolution, they think there was a radical period under Obregón. There was a radical period under Cárdenas. In the first radical period, Tamayo was absolutely active. And I mentioned a little bit in my little blurb that I sort of sent out, but I thought I would share a couple of these things with you, if I can quickly find it. He was buddies with Orozco. He was very good with Rivera until 38, where when he sort of signed that radical sort of Trotsky sort of claim. In 1929, Diego Rivera asks him to come and help reform education in art. So the experiences between 21 and 29, as much as there had been some tensions prior to that, Rivera thought, you know who ultimately is one of the best art teachers? and the most devoted to art education, because from the point of view of Tamayo, if you want to bring art to the people, you teach them how to make and look at art, but you teach them the technical skills of making art, but they will find their own art within them. Rivera agreed with him at that point. He absolutely agreed and said, let's try to do this. So they revamp, and Rivera actually has a full kind of plan that you can, that is easily found on the internet. And it is very specific about the whole course of study and how do you develop these sensibilities. Tamayo is his right-hand man throughout this. He, however, because the Mexican Revolution is, during the Calles years, is getting more conservative, they end up finding the Tamayo-Rivera approach to education to be ultimately too revolutionary. And they fire Rivera, and then Tamayo's like, well, I'm out. I'm not going to stay here in this kind of hostile environment. Although he does then go in, he goes into the Ministry of Education and tries to promote elementary art education at that level for a couple of years. So he really believes that the solution to revolutionizing art is to teach art to children of all backgrounds, not to paint murals on the sides of buildings. So that's sort of where that contest is. There's a couple of quotes I want to end with, if you'll indulge me. But one is about sort of Mexicanness. So like Rivera sort of famously says that, he has a quote where he comes back he comes back from France and says, he says that returning home from his artistic studies, he finds that his art is like a tree which grows in a particular place and has a trunk, leaves, blossoms, boughs, fruit, and roots of its own. The secret of my best work is that it is Mexican. And this is kind of one of Rivera's kind of famous quotes where he's embracing as a kind of champion of Mexicanidad. As an aside, it was Vasconcelos, well before the Mexican Revolution, who was part of this kind of Renaissance group, which Diego Rivera was a member of. And it is Vasconcelos who encourages them to begin to embrace a revolutionary stance. And he's the one who actually joins the kind of Maderistas to oppose Porfirio Diaz, well before any of the big three are radicalized. So Vasconcelos is like, we have to oppose this, and we have to develop a kind of Mexican identity. When Rivera comes back, he makes that claim. What the kind of counterpoint would be Tamayo, when he says, there is no place in art for political or ideological manifestations. Painting is painting, and there is no need of mixing it with any other thing. That has been the error of Mexican painting. And then the quote that that both Elizabeth and I borrowed for our titles: art is a means of expression that must be understood by everybody, everywhere. It grows out of the earth. The textures of our lives and our experience do not set out to make Mexican art or American, Chinese, or Russian art. Think in terms of universality. For Tamayo for the Mexican Revolution to be ultimately successful and not just turn into the kind of bourgeois mess that it kind of became for a long time, he thought we needed to make it more universal, as opposed to making it this kind of champion of a borrowed Marxist ideology. I don't know if there's time for anything else, because I see that it's 3:34. So I'll open up for any questions. I'm sorry if I took a long time, but
I'm not shutting down the Zoom, so we can stay open.
So there's a lot more to say. I'm sorry, I spazzed through these. We'll leave that one there. Any comments, questions?
I am wondering, oh, sorry, Dr. Let's go ahead.
I was just going to add, in terms of what I was saying about Perret, it seems to me that one understands why they had this affinity for each other, because it seems to me it's exactly why Perret is breaking with Breton and Aragon, with the notion of some kind of universality. So that's very interesting.
Lori?
Yeah, so the concepts of universality, right? I'm reflecting back, thinking about Paz and Tamayo, and I like especially like the representations that Tamayo was so drawn to, like the indigeneity and the death and resurrection, the fertility that's in like the Zapotec stuff. And it reminds me of where Paz was going when he wrote about the Marquis de Sade, when he wrote Erotic Beyond, when he wrote essay called Double Flame, Love and Eroticism. And he wrote Piedra del Sol back in 57, right? And you can kind of chart the lines of thought that were contemporary and parallel between Tamayo and Paz very easily if you're lining up the works that were being produced by each of them. But we skip forward, you know, Tamayo pieced out in the early 90s, Paz followed in 98. We saw kind of like a contemporary resurrection when Alfonso Cuarón made the film Y Tu Mama Tambien in 2001, where it was like on the screen, it was very much a representation of the Labyrinth of Solitude, right? And Erotic Beyond. And so now I'm sitting here thinking, okay, well, it's been almost 20 years since that happened. Where is the contemporary torchbearer bringing this forward now? Has that been lost in Mexican art and dialogue? Where is it now?
I'm guessing someone other than myself might be have a better answer to this, but the one thing that's important about Tamayo and much less so Paz, but he did a lot of the work. I mean, so from basically 1940, really until like the late 70s, his major residence was in the United States. He also moved to Paris for a while, etc. But he was outside. He kept a home in Mexico and visited often. He would spend sometimes a couple of months a year. But if to be a Mexican torchbearer of Tamayo is to be an international artist and less a Mexican artist. So I'm not sure who they are and where they are, but Elizabeth might know. But I think one of them is on the walls of the museum. I don't know.
That's what I hope. I mean, I was kind of trying to do that again. Some, you know, well, you know, when you mentioned George Biddle, I got to say my heart was singing because you and I have talked about this before, Dr. Maher. This was my graduate thesis was all about, you know, the Mexican influence on murals during the 30s in this country. But when I found Rivera, I got very excited because I feel like Tina Rivera she's not necessarily trying to be that standard bearer, but she certainly reminds me of what's happening. And she said she was one of the first people in Minneapolis, and she actually had to travel outside of her area to try to pursue her Mexican citizenship. So she's very staunchly from Minneapolis. You can hear it in her accent. And she's also from, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Michoacan, where all the beautiful butterflies go. And so her mother, she would spend time traveling down there. And so she's very sort of interested in issues of identity and Mexican identity and American identity and what it means for her to be biracial, which makes me think also of Frida Kahlo, kind of, you know, pushing aside her own German heritage to embrace her indigenous roots, right? Her costume and all of that. So I don't know that I think Tina would be like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed, but sure, you know, and she's much lesser known. She's not an emerging artist. She's very well established in the Midwest, but she's not like known as widely as Tamayo would have been, certainly. So I'm sure there are others.
So kind of like one foot in both worlds then, right? So like when you
for
said
her,
Kahlo,
absolutely.
I immediately think of Kahlo's painting, My Dress Hangs There. You know,
Right.
like her experience of like taking off her identity and hanging it up in order to fit in when she was in the United States, but yet not giving it up because she was still expressing it in her painting.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things coming out of this for me was in the talk that she did, which is archived, and I can send you a link. the students were asking her about her identity, and she talked about a license plate print. And it is a Minnesota license plate that is her real license plate, but she's made a lithograph out of it, a color litho, and it says Mexico. It just says Mexico. And she said, I can't even tell you how many times I've been pulled over. Been pulled over by cops who say, let's see your ID. Look, this is my Minnesota plate. Dear officer. Talk about needing to retrain officers. But dealing with travel literally back and forth. So a big piece of her work is also about her constant kind of migration with her family, and the strange kind of mix of invented language that her Mexican mother and Irish father created when they met in 1960s in Mexico. They've got that kind of a funny lingo that they made that's all their own. So yeah, all kinds of issues of identity. And while I'm still talking, I got to say, I've never seen that one print that is with that massive lithostone. That just made me salivate. That's, I mean, having done some lithography.
So if Mixographia, there's actually, let's see if I can, if I lost my ability. Luckily I have a mouse as well. If I can, this one. Yeah. If you just Google Mixographia, the first hit will be their own website. And they have a little film about the process. And if you go to about minute 3:15, it's very short, but at 3:15, it does a little thing about the making of this and the relationship with Tamayo. Super interesting, Mixographia.
If you've never done lithography with a stone like this, I've never done one with a stone that's bigger than, say, 3 by 2 feet. And I mean, this is back when I was an undergrad, but I remember the rhythm of it, the collaborative nature of it, how earthy it was when you think about the way that he draws and paints and creates these images that make you want to touch them. I mean, when you do lithography, you have to levigate the stone, which is with this large, round metal piece, water on the stone, and you're moving it around in circles like you're doing. I don't know. You're just trying to remove the image, to prep it. It takes a lot of work to kind of finesse it. I can't even imagine. You'd be very, very. You would never need a gym membership if you had a stone that big to work with. Anyway, I love this. It was really beautiful to learn about it.
On the website, it says they can't loan it out. So you got to go to the factory to see it, because there it is. I have one more answer to Laurie's question. It's a short answer, but I think from Tamayos' perspective, the true legacy that if he's right about revolutionary art, that revolutionary art should empower people through education, that the torchbearers of that vision would be a sort of a multitude of artists, all doing different stuff, all free to ignore whatever rules and borrow whatever forms. And it would be a flourishing of variety rather than anyone who does anything that's sort of stylistically recognizable.
Art of the people, truly of the people and by the people.
Nick, what drew him to the United States? He said he spent a good bit of time here.
So it's actually, I'm glad you asked. If people are willing to stay for a minute, I thought I printed out everything, but maybe I didn't. I'll just have to do it from memory. So he really leaves in 1938, and he leaves for a couple of reasons. But in 1936, interestingly, he is part of a revolutionary artist group called, I think it's called LEAP. I'll actually call up my own notes for a second. If I can spell it right. Wow. And he actually goes to the United States as a representative. He goes in the company of Siqueiros and Orozco to try to sort of promote a more revolutionary sort of attitude about art. This is under Cardenas. He actually does for a while. It's not LEAP, sorry, it's LEAR. That's why I couldn't find it. It is the Liga Escritores y Artistas Revolucionarios. And he goes for a little while in 1936 and really meets, so it is a league of writers and artists. So there are and musicians are actually heavily sort of, and there's an enormous response in the US. Artists from all over the United States and actually other countries are like, we're really interested because even in 36, the Mexican sort of revolutionary art movements still resonate with the rest of the world. So this is a group that's going out to kind of spread the wealth, and he was a part of it. And I was getting a little uncomfortable because Siqueiros in particular, he had already been jailed a couple times for his social activity, and including acts of violence at times. So he was definitely a radical socialist, and he was beginning to feel that the idea that the sort of radical socialism and art were at cross purposes, but he did go there and had a fantastic time and thought, I'm coming back. And then in 38, when there's this kind of rift between him and Rivera, because Rivera had always been, as I said, he kind of was a sponsor of Tamayo in the early going. And then when maybe I have, Rivera's got around 38, he says something, goes, there is a point where every artist has to put down his magic brush and fight for social justice. And that might be a slightly misquote, but the magic brush part is right. And Tamayo obviously thought, no, the brush is that's my thing. Like you can't, I can't make one in service of the other or put it down. And he thought, Rivera's gone wrong, like Siqueiros.
I was just going to ask you, when Siqueiros became more and more radical, I mean, he was probably in and out of jail more than any of them, right? What did they have anything to do with one another after a while, he and Tamayo?
Yeah, actually, interestingly, so Siqueiros actually participated a bit when Rivera was trying to revamp art education. Siqueiros would come in and consult. So he was connected with him. And obviously in 36, they were allies, if not great friends. But Siqueiros did make some snarky comments about Tamayo over the years. And I'm not going to recall exactly the nature of them, but basically it was targeted at the idea of easel painting. Siqueiros actually uses the term in his 1921 or 22 manifesto, the three calls, the tres llamadas for, he does it, and then he does another manifesto, and he actually says we need to not do easel painting, and he says this. Actually, I have this for you as a quote. He says, we repudiate, this is in his 1922 Declaration of Social Political Aesthetic Principles. We repudiate so-called easel painting and every kind of art favored by ultra-intellectual circles because it is aristocratic. We praise monumental art in all its forms because it is public property. And given that that's his statement, every time he refers to Tamayo as essentially a mere easel painter, he's basically saying that this is a bourgeois traitor to the cause. So they increasingly diverge. He does. I mean, there's in response once and this is like I think it's in the 40s, but I may be a decade off. Asked about this idea of easel painting, he says, I love, because I've played around with a lot of different forms. I actually like sculpture, I like lithograph, I like all of these forms, and I'm really interested in every possible form. He goes, but in the end, canvas is just the best. And when he says that, what he means is not a wall, a canvas. And so he does begin to sort of say, yeah, I'm a canvas painter. I am an easel painter. He's often seen as sort of quote middle class. He never really responds as directly to whatever middle classness might mean.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, because, you know, when you think about different media that is more for the people or for select people, you know, there's an equalizing effect when you've got something that's seen by everyone on the side of a building, or that's available in multiples, right? As opposed to an individual painting is very precious, one thing.
No, I mean, any kind of, you know, print, any lithographic print or whatever print that there could be multiple copies of, you can get them all over the place. You can see them. So yeah, I think size, from Siqueiros' point of view, at least size matters.
Any other questions? This is such a good group. Thank you for doing this, Nick. Really appreciate it.
I'm glad you're able to get here, even though it's raining.
And then reconnected with his alumna, who's so cool, and is now going to be talking to all our classes, I guess.
I have one closing question, if y'all don't mind. Back to the mural from Smith College. When that came up, I was wondering if you saw, or you took from that, any symbolism in a creation story.
I'm trying to find where I had it. No. Not that one. There we go.
There it is.
Nature and the artist. So it's a creation story in terms of artistic creation, I think. It is the artist as creator. It is interesting because he actually writes, he doesn't write, he spoke it, but because, you know, it's a commission, he has to speak about it. So he actually says, a few things about it, but it's primarily about being an artist.
Because I just wonder, like, I think about like the birthing symbolism, right? Like touching something, creating something and having it come forth, right? And when I think about looking about that as a scale, for a minute, I'm thinking about standing there in front of it. And for a minute, when I was looking at that, I kind of had this flashback from my own travels, like standing in the Sistine Chapel, standing underneath, you know, the God touches man, and looking at the panels that correspond to that one panel, right? And it's, you know, if you ever sat in an art history class with Jeffrey Collins, he can wax poetic about the symbolism around that, and how you kind of look at the robes flowing around it, and it looks kind of like a brainstem, right? And it's like the mind of God, and there's all this forethought thinking about creation and how everything is going to turn out. And so when I look at this and I see like there's like a rainbow, maybe like the symbolism of like spirit touching like somebody else, and I'm wondering what he was envisioning about birthing forth and creation. It was just in that split second of seeing that, I wondered. And there's the shadows behind, and is it like the consciousness, right? Kind of like that transpersonal stuff that Jung talks about.
You know, I think you've probably spoken to the sort of themes as well as I can. I know you've read your Octavio Paz, who also writes about this as this idea of like that he's always interested in the spectator, and that, which I think is the one element that is of interest to me in this, because this is the kind of thing where I sort of feel like of his murals, it's one of the ones that would go with his the reason that he was so interested in art education, and he puts it there, and the idea is that this is actually a kind of a lesson, which is doubly interesting, in part because one of the things he doesn't like about grand murals is the sort of didactic nature of it. And I feel like this one's actually a bit more didactic in terms of sort of, I mean, obviously everything you said I think is there, but I also think he's asking you to step kind of in and out of this picture and think about it from a bunch of different perspectives, and not just like he really doesn't want for most of his art for the response to be kind of intellectual and analytic in that way. It's symbolic, but not that you can, when asked what his art means, more often than not, he says, it just is. This one is different. This one, he actually talks about it, and it is. I mean, it's for a college. It's about all his ideas. And so he actually, oddly, I think this is sort of his equivalent. It's sort of a Tamayo equivalent of some of those kind of late 20s, early 30s, big three murals.
You also really see the influence of Picasso in this. And when you talk about stepping in and out, it makes me think of kind of the beginnings of, a little bit of Cubism and totally different iconography, but it also made me think of Guernica, very different, content, but just in its rhythm across the, formally across the canvas or wall.
It's interesting. Guernica was hugely important to Tamayo. When you read about his response when he first saw it, it's a little bit like, if you'll forgive this analogy, but it's a little bit like when the Beach Boys had come out with Pet Shop. What is it? Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds. They come out with Pet Sounds, and they're having a party, a celebration of the best album they've ever made. And someone brought Magical Mystery Tour to the party, and they put it on. And Brian Wilson said he went into a deep depression and said he never wanted to make music again. Tamayo thought he was basically all that. And then he saw Picasso's grand work, and he's like, whoa, I didn't know anything until now. So it is enormously important. And interestingly, that is a Picasso piece that is actually in response to fashion. I mean, it is definitely political. It is anti-fascist. It is even part of a kind of, Picasso was genuinely interested in kind of overthrowing Franco and understanding the kind of violence of a regime that is a violence that is on multiple levels. His, I believe the picture that I used for the dogs is the first thing that, this is 41. I don't know if I can remember from Guernica, but I believe this one, or one very, very similar, this was like, I finally knew, because he had been trying to work with dogs, and he's like, I finally, after seeing Picasso's work, was able to do it. So it blows his mind. It's like, he thinks it's like the greatest thing he'd ever seen. And it is a revolutionary piece by Picasso, interestingly. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that fits in perfectly with the Tamayo kind of worldview.
Seeing that in person was one of the best things I've ever experienced. And then immediately after that, I was mugged. But it really, right in that moment, I was so excited. And I was alone in the room with it. Just its grand, sapped of color. It was so incredible.